Most people are under the belief that there is only one remaining lifeboat from the White Star Line, lifeboat number 2 belonging to the tender SS Nomadic, which has been preserved and restored by the Nomadic Preservation Society. But you may be surprised to find out that there is indeed another lifeboat from the White Star Line in existence today. It's larger and older than the one from Nomadic. Now, none of this is intended to negate the historical value of Nomadic's lifeboat, but this lifeboat certainly deserves attention too. The Nomadic Preservation Society, which, like much of the public, once believed that Nomadic's lifeboat was the only surviving White Star Line lifeboat, has since updated their website to acknowledge the existence of a second, lifeboat number 6, from the RMS Oceanic. What is this lifeboat's story, and where does it fall into Titanic's broader story? Let's find out. Welcome to the Steam and Splendor Network. The year was 1914, and the same folks who brought us the Titanic disaster were back at it for a sequel. Sort of. Some of the same cast of characters known from Titanic's story were cast in this sequel, too. Familiar names such as Lieutenant Charles H. Lightoller, who served as Titanic's second officer, and Lieutenant David Blair, who had originally been tapped to serve as Titanic's second officer, and who actually made the trial trip in that role, but who had been left behind at Southampton at the last minute, once Chief Officer Henry Wilde was transferred aboard shortly before the maiden voyage, leading to a shakeup in the officer ranks. By this point, World War I had burst onto the world scene, and the White Star Line's RMS Oceanic had been converted into the HMS Oceanic, a merchant cruiser complete with 4.7-inch deck guns and a complement of Royal Marines. At this point, it's worth pausing for a moment to catch you all up on the ship that we're talking about here, and a little of her history. Oceanic was known as the White Star Line's Ship of the Century, launched on January 14, 1899, and starting her maiden voyage from Liverpool, England to New York on September 6th of that year. Oceanic was very much a turning point in the history of the White Star Line. For one thing, she was the brainchild of Thomas Henry Ismay, the founder of the company. He would die only 2.5 months after Oceanic started her maiden voyage. From that point forward, the reins of the company would be taken over by his son, Joseph Bruce Ismay, who would lead the company into the 20th century and who would become so well known through his presence aboard Titanic during her disastrous maiden voyage. So, Oceanic definitely represented the end of one era and the start of another. On September 8, 1914, HMS Oceanic was patrolling the waters around the Shetland Islands. The ship was under the command of Royal Navy Captain William Slater, who had orders to stop and search any merchant vessel suspected of carrying supplies for Germany or its allies, as part of the blockade of that nation. The vessel's merchant master, Captain Henry Smith, also remained aboard the Oceanic. Essentially, the ship had two captains, which appears to have been a recipe for disaster. The Oceanic was zigzagging to avoid any potential attacks from U-boats, and this maneuvering made accurate navigation difficult. Unbeknownst to the crew, they were approximately 14 miles off course and were approaching the notorious Schalds of Faula. This reef came within a few feet of the surface of the water and was easily visible as a line of white water when there was significant wave action. However, on a flat, calm day such as the 8th of September, no sign of its presence could be detected. During the morning watch, Captain Smith was uneasy of the vessel's course and altered its heading back out to sea. Captain Slater felt the change in course and reappeared on the bridge, countermanding Smith's orders, manifesting the difficulties of the ship having two masters. It turned out to be an ill-informed decision, as within moments the ship grounded itself on the shoals with a sickening crunch and was unable to be moved. Several vessels attempted to tow Oceanic off the reef, but to no avail. With Oceanic helplessly stranded and its bottom torn out, the order to abandon ship was given. Over 600 men had to be evacuated, including a German prisoner who, quote, thought it all a great joke. Lieutenant Lightoller, for the third time in his career, found himself loading and lowering lifeboats aboard a doomed ship. Lightoller, having served aboard the Oceanic on more than one occasion before the war, had a special affinity for the ship and was greatly saddened by its impending loss. So much so that he took a moment to take a souvenir with him, the ship's clock from the wheelhouse, which he later installed in his private yacht Sundowner. The Oceanic was so firmly planted atop the rocks that for 2 weeks it stood there like some sort of perverse monument. On September 29, 1914, a heavy gale blew through the area, and the Oceanic disintegrated under the pressure of the wind and the sea. Its remains scattered underwater along the shoals. The war had claimed its first passenger liner, ironically lost to poor navigation and not enemy fire. After the sinking, Captain Slater and Smith, along with Lieutenant David Blair, the ship's navigator, were court-martialed. Blair received a reprimand for stranding the ship, while both captains were absolved of any blame. This was particularly surprising since Blair had been under the supervision of the captains at the time of the accident. Blair, whose transfer off the Titanic at the last moment, has been erroneously blamed for the lookouts not having access to binoculars in the crow's nest, shouldered the blame yet again, unjustly. Following the Oceanic's loss, the British Admiralty changed their policy so that merchant ships would have their own captains, rather than two being in charge. The Oceanic was a total loss, and evacuated lifeboat number 6 was one of the last lifeboats to leave the ship. Once ashore, the lifeboat was cast adrift. It drifted north to Eshenus and was then towed down to Lerwick. Immediately, she was snatched up by salvagers and used as a small passenger boat. In 1920, she was converted into a launch. With a motor and a forward deck installed, she changed hands several more times and was eventually donated to the Shetland Museum in 2001. This centennial lifeboat was now in serious need of restoration, and the decision was made by the museum to restore her to her original White Star Line glory, even prior to the acquisition by the Royal Navy, removing the remnants of the motor and the deck installed, and then cleaning up the wooden timbers, which were in surprisingly good condition. Restoration began in 2015, when all non-original timber was removed. The top 2 planks in the original gunnels were reinstalled, the stem and stern replaced, and the keel scarfed. Thwarts across the width and along the sides, which were removed in the 1920s, were replaced the next winter in the second phase of restoration. All of the finishing touches were completed, including making a new rudder. As curator Dr. Ian Tate explained, one of the most time-consuming aspects is the painting, with wood filling, sanding, and undercoating to be done before the top coat can even begin. And there's a lot of fiddly detail on the interior. The boat builders Jack Duncan and Robbie Tate were joined by White Star Line enthusiast Graham Taylor, who very generously volunteered his time to undertake this work, and his dedication in preparing and painting RMS Oceanic's lifeboat was indispensable to the project. The original colors were reinstated: cream hull, brown gunnels, and buff inboard. The lifeboat is now in perfect condition, but is not on public display. It is owned by the Shetland Museum, which is located at Hayes Dock in Lerwick, Scotland. So that's at least 2 lifeboats from the White Star Line that survive today, but can it be argued that there are more? Sure, there can always be 1 or 2 sitting in some boat barn or in someone's yard, unknown to researchers, that can surface in the future. But are there others? We can also look at wrecks like the HMS Britannic, sitting on her side at the bottom of the Aegean Sea. She sank with some of her boats still on her davits, and while the boats have long since been eaten away as far as we can tell, could other White Star Line lifeboats exist somewhere beneath the waves on a wreck, with the potential of someday being saved? Unlikely, but maybe. But if you want to argue another technicality, the RMS Queen Mary was built under the flag of Cunard-White Star, when the White Star Line had merged with her rival. Would her lifeboats count as White Star Line then? She had 24 lifeboats when built, all partially under the White Star Line flag. Over the years, they were swapped out and possibly a few of them were replaced, but most of them lingered until her later career. As other Cunard liners were retired and scrapped, such as the Saxonia, the Ivernia, or the Sylvania, their boats that were in the best condition were swapped into Queen Mary's complement, replacing her boats that were in the worst condition. When Queen Mary was decommissioned in 1967 and subsequently transformed into a hotel in Long Beach, California, she had on her davits some of her original boats, as well as boats from her sister, the Queen Elizabeth, and boats from other Cunard ships. It caused controversy in 2022 when several of Queen Mary's boats were scrapped. The scrapping took place right in the parking lot in a fenced-off perimeter. The city of Long Beach did advertise that they would give away the boats for free to anyone who could prove the ability to transport, preserve, and contain the contaminants in the paint, but nobody stepped forward. Did we lose original White Star Line lifeboats that day? Not likely. It's been said that the boats torn up were either replicas made for the hotel service or boats from other Cunard liners, in which case some historical artifacts were lost but not White Star Line ones. It's said that any boat original to the Queen Mary's early service were preserved. I happened to be in the right place at the right time to catch these boats getting scrapped and managed to catch the last video and photos of their existence. It was hard watching the wreckers tear into the boats, shaking them around as they ripped pieces off, almost like a beast hunting an animal. No, I was not allowed to take a souvenir, and security was tight. As far as we know, there are only 2 contenders for surviving White Star Line lifeboats: the Oceanics at the Shetland Museum and the Nomadic one with the Nomadic Preservation Society. And perhaps surviving boats from the early service of the Queen Mary, but that's just a technicality. I would like to thank Graham Taylor for providing most of the restoration photos and footage of Oceanic's lifeboat that were used in this video.
A special thank you to our supporters on Patreon, including Dean McIntosh, Evan Plumbing, Lucas Sidlowski, Charlotte Zurich, Bluebird Nut, Martin Cahill, Sam Forker, Maximilian Metcalf, Milos15 Gameplays, Nikki Chan 92, Rachel Warner Sanchez, Leslie Sheldon, Jason Stray, Roadway Wiz, and Snow Monkey.